All right, hello everybody. Thanks for having me today. I'm here to give a brief talk about sort of Shenzhen and sort of how its ecosystem has evolved over time and into its own sort of style of innovation, its own style of thinking in terms of design and IP and so forth. So. First thing first, I'm going to start the talk a bit with a kind of guided tour of Shenzhen to try and introduce people to what it's about and what's made there, how things happen, and then I'm going to pivot a bit from there into talking about how intellectual property plays into this and how ideas are traded inside the ecosystem. So it sounds like some people have some familiarity with Shenzhen, but we'll get started sort of in what I call like a zoom in tour of Shenzhen. So the idea is there's this great series from the 1970s called The Powers of 10, where you start out from like the universe and you zoom in, you zoom in, and zoom in until finally you reach someone's hand, and then you end up at the atomic level. And so I'm going to start first kind of like a 1x zoom of Shenzhen and then kind of keep on zooming in until we end up at the street corners of the area. Um, oh yeah, one other note is before I get into that sort of zooming in tour, I want to clarify when I say the word Shenzhen, I'm actually sort of referring to the whole Pearl River Delta area. So a lot of people have used Shenzhen sort of like they may use San Francisco to refer to Silicon Valley, which can refer to anywhere from like I don't know, Pleasanton all the way up to Santa Rosa or something like that. So it's not when people talk about Shenzhen. Sort of colloquially, they could be going to somewhere in Dongguan, they could be going to Guangzhou, but the whole area itself is actually quite large and consists of I don't know 40 million people, and it has over pretty close to half a trillion dollars of GDP. Um, and so yeah, and so the question is, how did this area essentially go from a fishing village to a tech powerhouse in about 30 years? And so when I first started visiting Shenzhen about 10 years ago, I told my mom I was going to go visit, and she's actually Chinese descent, but has grown up in America for the last 50 years or something like that. And she asked me like, why would I go to a place that's like essentially a slum and a fishing village, because that's what it was back in the 80s, around the time that last time she had visited the country. And now, this picture here is like actually a pretty common image of a sort of a stall that you can find almost along the street side of people fixing iPhones and so forth, with some fairly advanced equipment and techniques. So, sort of starting at a 1x zoom of Shenzhen ecosystem, there's sort of the stereotypes that you have about China, right? You go there to build stuff. There's companies like Foxconn that have over 1 million employees and over $100 billion in revenue. They make over 100 million major products per month. People are generally aware that China is sort of a communist country and that iPhones are made there. And then you start to end up with these sort of interesting stories about like both of these products shown on the screen here are made in Shenzhen. So the product on the right is an iPhone 6, and the product on the left is something that looks like an iPhone 6, but it's much smaller and runs Android and costs about $40. Um, and then if you go around the ecosystem, you find that it's actually more about just iPhones and their clones. You have, here's a picture of sort of a typical vendor's stall of selling the local wares. You can see from the picture in the top left there's every single object in that case there is capable of placing a phone call. So I have these little sort of model car shaped phones. Phones that are in sort of these sort of kid friendly packages and so forth. And below, I've shown you a picture of what looks like an Apple Watch, except that it actually has the phone built into it. So it doesn't have to tether to a phone to make a call. They actually put the whole baseband into the watch itself. And the locals are very proud of that. They're like, why did Apple build a watch that couldn't place calls? They're very confused about that. So they just put the phone into the watch. And then they have here on the right-hand side a picture of a phone that's made to look like a pack of cigarettes for whatever reason, but you can get that there too. So then you zoom in a little more and you say, okay, well, let's get in the ground in Shenzhen and go to the electronics district. Here's a picture actually from one of the buildings near the area. And this looks like a pretty big urban center, and one might be tempted to think this is like a financial district or something like this, but actually every single building that you see in this photo here is devoted to the trade of electronics. And in the lower right-hand corner is sort of a Google Maps view of the area. It's about a mile on a side of high-rise buildings chock full of electronic stalls and vendors and designers and trade. This is sort of like one of the cores of electronics ecosystem in Shenzhen. It's called Huaqiangbei, and it's been around for a while, and it continues to be, surprisingly, the core of the ecosystem. If you know how quickly things change in China, anything sort of sticking around in pole position for more than a decade is pretty remarkable. If you were to walk into one of these buildings, this is a scene that you would see. It's kind of structured after a wet market, like a butcher's market or something like this, where you have a bunch of small stalls that are about maybe like 10 feet long that contain essentially one style of electronics. So you can walk up to a stall and they'll have a person who sells LEDs. Another stall will sell cases for computers. Another stall will sell just screws of some type. Another one will specialize in resistors and capacitors. And you can walk around in these areas and source different types of components. This is at 100,000 zoom. This is what it looks like inside one of these stalls. So the stall on the left, I don't know how familiar people are with how components are traded, but the round things you see in the window are what are called tape and reels of capacitors. This one specializes primarily in capacitors, and each of those reels contains 10,000 capacitors, and each of those boxes contain about 10 reels. So you're looking at millions of capacitors right now sitting inside of a store, which you can just walk up to with a few bucks and buy one of these, and then walk to your production line and go to mass production. So it's a very over-the-counter method for buying production quantities of components. And on the right-hand side is a picture of some chips they just have sitting out in trays. And it was interesting. I went around once to sort of looked a little more carefully at the part numbers and realized that the inventory that they had on hand in some of these stalls was bigger than the inventory they had online at places like DigiKey or Mouser, if you're familiar with some of the distributors. So the amount of capability that exists in this market is pretty remarkable. Here's another image of like what one of the stalls look like. They tend to be family affairs. They're run by mom and pops, and a lot of people don't necessarily have a technical background. They're more traders, all from the same village. A lot of them are from the same village in China, so they speak a particular dialect. And if you have tried to learn the language of the market, you'll find that actually they use different terms for the electronic components than the academics would. So if you were to go to the Chinese Academy of Sciences and learn what a transistor is, and you went to the market and tried to buy one of those, they would look at you funny. They use a much simpler description of transistors. They call it a three-legged tube, for example, as opposed to a metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor. And in the lower right-hand corner is a picture of sort of like the hustle and bustle of the market. They just load up trolleys with components, and they're just hand pushing around the market and going to production with them. So taking another zoom in on the ecosystem, and you look around just in the streets, one will start to notice an interesting phenomenon. You'll see people just standing around taking apart mobile phones in the street. the picture on the left is outside of an apartment complex where I'd stayed. In the morning, you would see people sort of just squatting over piles of scrap phones, and on the right-hand side is a picture of a typical sort of phone scrap vendor. He just sort of set up outside some carts, put a little sign down, has a couple burlap sacks, and starts processing through phones. And if people want to come up and buy parts from him, or try to get him to buy some of their parts, they could do that. This is another picture here where you can see just an enormous number of phones, amount of kind of e-waste, so to speak, and people have just walked up to it and started just sort of shucking out valuable components from these phones. And the interesting part is, if you just look towards the back there, you can see those kind of teal seats where the guys are sitting. That's actually like a little like food stall behind there, and to the left you can also see there's another, just the hint of another food stall. So the broader context of this is that this is happening on sort of the footsteps to a restaurant area, so to speak. So it's a very casual thing to happen there. It's not like this happens in one specific area. People just sort of get together, and at certain times of the day, waste will show up and people will start pulling components out and doing what with them, right, is sort of an interesting question. And so I've looked at sort of this ecosystem from the top to the bottom and try to figure out, like, how does this come about? And so turning this picture sort of upside down and figuring out how we got to where we are today, we can take a look at sort of the numbers that I think they have gotten us to the point where we are in China from the trickle-down sort of standpoint. So China starts with about 1 billion people in the 80s, and at that age, big companies like Foxconn and Huawei and so forth invest a bunch of money, particularly in the border town around Hong Kong, to sort of hire tens of millions of assembly laborers. And so this sort of leads to a diaspora of medium to small size factories. So you have like these large, what I call sort of the flagship factories, but every single flagship factory needs to have a set of subset factories that feed it components, or that even just maintain the machinery inside these factories. Like, if you look at a modern factory today, they may have like 1,000 CNCs on the inside. That in itself is enough to, sort of spawn an industry that maintains those CNCs. That sort of diaspora of medium to small factories happened in the 90s. About a decade later, those assembly laborers, maybe about 1% of those people, sort of eventually figure out enough from having done things to sort of become a technician or engineer. So they can repair things, or they can do some very sort of experience-based engineering of new products. And around that point in time, around the 2000s, what I call the rise of the Shanzai. So this is where technicians and engineers kind of get smart enough inside the factories to realize that their bosses are making bad decisions. And so you have a bunch of people who work for like Motorola and Nokia at the time, who sort of had risen up through the ranks and weren't from the Western design team side, but were local people who said, "You guys are stupid, you're building phones the wrong way. We're going to quit and we're going to make our own phones the way we want to see the phones being made." And so this is where you start to see the rise of the copycats, and they're sort of jumping out and building phones at much, much less, sort of labor and effort and cost than what the larger brands are able to do. And so now you have like sort of like at this point, thousands of managers and designers who have gone out and decided to start their own little sort of Shanzai shop. This is around the 2000s. And out of these thousands of managers and designers who are building phones, we've now got about 10 or so major new tech corporations, which we're starting to hear about and sort of feel the influence of out here in the United States. So we hear the words, the brands of Xiaomi, who has sort of Shanzai roots, but is now a major player in the cell phone space. Tencent, Taobao, and Alibaba, and so forth, who have sort of risen out of this sort of trickle down, sort of bomb up innovation that has emerged from the Shenzhen ecosystem. An interesting point that that parallels this is how the supply chain and the capital equipment has evolved along with it. So on the left here, you can see sort of a parallel sort of trickle down chart for how the equipment moves through the ecosystem. So some decades ago, someone will invest $1 million to buy a state-of-the-art pick and place line. And so the picture on the right here is actually something I just shot from an image of well, I was, on one of the highways. This is a whole pick and place line that's been loaded onto the back of a truck. And it's someone's trading it or adding capacity to the facility, but it's done in the interesting part about it's done in such a haphazard way. They just sort of put danger tape over the thing and strapped it down and just they're shipping it off. And back when this line was new, it would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's no way you would have shipped it around, but clearly today they're just loading on the back of a truck and sending it around. And so what happens is that some decades ago, someone invested $1 million into top-of-the-line assembly equipment. After about three or 5 years or so, the equipment's depreciated. Like you've written it off, you've built a whole bunch of phones with it, and to stay competitive, you have to buy a new $1 million line. You don't take the old line and throw it away. You sell it to someone else for a tenth of what you bought it for. So you sell it as scrap for $100,000. Except that scrap doesn't sit idle. Someone immediately takes it. They'll use it for 10 years to build something that's not a cell phone, but maybe they'll build some other, consumer product like a router or something like that that's not as competitive but still demanding for about 10 years. And after about 10 years of using that, they're going to sell that for scrap for about 10% of what they got for. So they'll sell this $1 million line for $10,000. And then this line, which is a robot, so it doesn't forget, it doesn't really go bad, it still has the same precision as it does, is sold for $10,000 to these small factories. And it has the capability to build mobile phones, but the capital requirement to buy the equipment to build the mobile phones has now gone to just a fraction, pennies on the dollar, of what used to cost, back in the time when it was originally purchased. So what you have is a lot of excess capability for building pretty high-end gear in the ecosystem for cheap because of the trickle-down supply chain that's paralleled the trickle-down innovation. And this leads us to sort of a explanation, a partial explanation at least, for what we're seeing going on in the streets here with this recycling. So you have this sort of parallel around the parts and the recycling business in going on in the ecosystem. So if you look at this chart here, we have, for example, someone building 1 million+ unit builds. And what you have when you're going to go and build, for example, like an iPhone or any mobile phone, is that you have what I call the hot dog and buns problem. Say if you want to build, or say you want to have a barbecue, and you go out and you buy hot dogs and you buy buns, you find hot dogs come in packs of 8 and buns come in packs of 10. So when the barbecue is over, you're going to have either some hot dogs left over or some buns left over. And at the end of the day, if you're not throwing them away, you're making croutons or whatever it is of the buns. The same thing sort of happens when you have these large builds, is that you can't really line up your inventory to be exactly on as much as you need for every single part by the end of the build. And plus, when the demand tapers off, a lot of times you have a bit of inventory backed up in the pipe anyways. And so what happens is mere fractions of a percent of the 1 million+ unit build are being liquidated, typically at about 10 cents on the dollar. But the quantities at which these sort of builds happen at, even that small fraction turns into about 10,000 or so of some pretty interesting components. And so the right-hand path is a sort of more legitimate gray market method of dealing with this, where you have aggregators who will take scrap and excess from various different manufacturers that aggregate it, repackage it, and test it, sell it at 50% of the original price of the gray market. And then sort of the left-hand path is that, phones actually go and get used by users for a while. They turn to e-waste, and then they get recycled, and they also enter the gray market for recycling. And so this gets us onto sort of the subject of faking and sort of what it means to be recycling. And so to try and explain the situation a little bit more clearly, on the left-hand side here, you see what people would normally, I guess, on the outside say, hey, someone's faking an iPhone, right? Because, you can see what on the outset looks, a bit like an iPhone, but it's clearly not an iPhone. Now, the interesting part is that to build that thing on the left, the effort level is actually very difficult. But detecting it as a fake is very easy. So actually, this is not the predominant problem that you have to deal with in ecosystem in terms of fakes. What you have to deal with more typically in the ecosystem is what happens on the right-hand side. So here is a picture of an FPGA. It's a chip made by Xilinx. And the only way you can tell that this is a fake is that there's a little white rectangle on the sort of the laser etched part numbers on the chip. And over where that rectangle is someone's gone in with the laser cutter and they've actually etched off the words ES that used to exist on there. And the ES stands for engineering sample. So someone has gone and they've taken parts that were meant to be scrapped from a preliminary production run. They laser etched off the markings for it, and they've sold it into the supply chain as brand new parts. And so the effort level for creating this sort of fake, so to speak, is extremely easy, right? You didn't have to have an engineering degree, you didn't have to lay on any circuit boards. You just had to know that someone was throwing away a bunch of parts that were mostly usable. And detecting that is actually extremely difficult. You have to be trained to read the part numbers, understand what they are. And in fact, in this case, we only caught this because we were doing a JTAG Silicon ID verification of all the parts before we programmed them on the production line. And so, in general, the most notorious fakes aren't actually people going through and employing the engineering effort to sort of copy what people say are, Apple's innovation or Google's innovation out there. A lot of them are much simpler explanations. Like, for example, ghost shifts. A ghost shift is when they do a fourth shift at the factory. So during the time when everyone's supposed to leave and they shut down the factory, the supervisors stay around and they run it for another shift. So they take excess material or they take material that wasn't scheduled to be there. They run it on exactly the production hardware with exactly the production tests, and they crank out an extra run. And in that case, the question is that a fake or is that legitimate? Well, the brand would say this is a fake because they didn't get the margin of selling it as a brand because they've sort of done something at the very back end to be able to keep all the margin for themselves. But from the user standpoint, this is, it's virtually the same goods because it comes off the same lines of the same technicians. A lot of the fakes are also refurbished parts, remarked parts. There's a lot of warranty fraud that happens, and a lot of improperly destroyed production defects. So the picture here you see is a stall in sort of the markets that specialize in selling blank iPhone motherboards. So all these sort of black flat things you see there are iPhone motherboards that have had no components attached to them. They're actually all motherboards that were supposed to have been ground up and thrown away because they had one or more or too many small defects in them, but people actually buy these and they use them to build fake iPhones from scratch from other scrap parts that you see on the market. So one may wonder then, like, what is the financial incentive for people to go through and dig through these phones on the sidewalk? And very, very quickly, you can sort of see like across the bottom, a more complete picture of what happens. There's people who are digging parts of the phones on the left. You have technicians in the middle who are removing components from the phones in the middle. And on the right-hand side, you can see the parts sort of refurbished and polished up and being sold as new in these little sauce trays. Normally you would get soy sauce in them in a restaurant, but they just put chips on them instead. And so the value of the parts as new on the tray on the right-hand side may be about $10 a component. Those are flash memory chips. And when you walk into these stalls, they'll actually tell you these parts have been recycled. We'll sell them to you at half off. Like they don't try to sell them to you as new. They just be like, if you walk in these one of the stalls, they'll say, would you like the new ones or would you like the recycled ones? So they're very upfront about it, at least at that point in the supply chain. The key thing is that the cost of goods for those parts is zero. Like these people are literally going through e-waste and pulling them out. And a minimum wage worker in the area may be paid about 1,000 renminbi per month, about $160. And they use these minimum wage workers on the factory lines, and they train them actually to pull parts off of boards. And this is a legitimate operation that happens. So I was in a factory that made graphics cards, and I was watching them take graphics cards that didn't pass test. And they had a laborer there working with a hot air gun, like you can kind of see in that middle shot there, pulling off the memory chips, reballing them, and sending them back into the production line for use in other cards. These are the ones that didn't pass test. And so this person is being paid $160 per hour, is recovering about once every 4 or 5 minutes about $5 worth of parts for the factory. So they're creating an immense amount of value for the factory, but being paid almost nothing in terms of minimum wage. What happens is some of these workers figure out that they're making a lot of value for the factory, but not realizing any of it themselves. So they go out and they start figuring out how to pull parts off of phones, and they're producing dishes like the one below, which is about $2,000 worth of parts in that dish there alone. And they can sort of earn at a U.S. wage parity equivalent, assuming $8 minimum wage, about a $200,000 a year salary, effectively by sort of just, instead of working for the factory at minimum wage, going out, finding e-waste and refurbishing, recycling them, and turning them into resellable parts. So that explains, at least in one bit, why you see people in this ecosystem all over the place, just in the street digging stuff out of like phones, clawing them out, and a lot of people sitting around in stalls pulling parts off of motherboards, trying to inject them back into the supply chain. But the thing is like the parts themselves are only semi-useful. How do they go from these parts into novel phone lines? There's more required to that than a technician who is trained in the factory on how to use a soldering iron and how to reball BGAs. And so you're going to need some amount of design IP to take these parts and put them into phones. And here's actually a picture I pulled out of one of the local documents you can get there of someone explaining all the parts of a phone and so on and so forth, what's required to build it. And there's a system that I've been trying to sort of patch together there about how they share IP locally. It's not really open source. I give it a different name. I call it Gongkai. And the reason why I do that is because open source itself actually has a Chinese translation, and it refers to the same legal concept of open source in the United States. So I use a different Chinese word to refer to it so we don't confuse Gongkai with proper open source, which has been properly licensed and is totally legal from the Western standpoint. And this sort of Gongkai system has evolved in China with an absence of Western influence. But it has a similar sort of ability to enable access with a different legal construct, and it has allowed the innovators to rip, mix, and burn in hardware. And it's been fine-tuned over a long time for an ecosystem that values product over patent. But the question is sort of how did this whole ecosystem come about, where people are sharing IP and so on and so forth? There's as people from the West well know, patents are an important part of incentivizing people to take a risk to go ahead and innovate. And the reason, let's see, am I missing a slide here? Okay, right. Sorry, I have a slide queue over here. I was off by one. And so to review sort of what the Western social IP bargain is that sort of the United States Constitution sort of included in this a clause that gave Congress the power to promote progress in science and useful arts by allowing them to secure for a limited period of time the exclusive right to respective writings and discoveries. And so the idea is that you have a bargain where people would be given a material reward for taking risk to come up with ideas, and giving them in the term of monopoly rights. So if you go ahead and you go invest the time and effort to try and invent something, you may get a patent or a copyright on that idea, and that would allow you to monetize that. To sort of make up for the risk that you've taken to invest to come up with the idea. On the other hand, the idea behind patents in itself is that you publish the idea so other people can learn from it. That's the whole idea of a patent system, and that one of the bars of getting a patent is that you have to include enough material in the patent that someone experienced in the art can reproduce the patent itself. So it's sort of an idea of sharing the ideas to promote crowdsourced innovation. The problem with the U.S. patent system is that, quote unquote, limited times is an eternity in terms of technology. So it's a 20-year patent term. And to put that in perspective, the 8088, when it was introduced in 1979, ran at 5 megahertz, and 20 years later, the Pentium 3 copper miner was running at 800 megahertz. So technology just moves way too fast for patents to be effectively open sourcing ideas and reintroducing them into the ecosystem. And the other problem is that copyrights are, as many people are well aware, is effectively like 120 years. It's a lifetime, effectively. So it's not like people aren't able to even own their childhood at this point in time. People who grew up to Star Wars will never be able to remix that into their own fan fiction without having to pay, I guess now, Disney rights to those characters. The thing is that motivations have changed, and so it's not so much about always money at this point in time. Open source, Western styled open source has evolved over people who don't necessarily want to have money as the motivator for them to create new ideas, but they may want, for example, public recognition, or they want a legacy or curiosity. They have some altruism. So open source was born of closed source law, where people go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to use the rights I have to this to just at least protect myself from liability and gain public recognition while going ahead and promoting the sharing of crowdsourced ideas. The problem is that even open source from the Western standpoint has a very heavy legal burden. So this is sort of one of those funny points where we saw sort of the open source initiative sue the open source Harvard initiative over the logo looking too similar to their logo. And a lot of the lawyers that were sort of involved in this were saying, well, but we have to sue each other over this, because if you don't try to protect your trademark, then the trademark loses its sort of validity in the Western theory of law. And so it's not like this sort of thing where open source in the Western ecosystem just happens and you don't have to spend a lot of money doing it. The point of this is that, like, if you want to exercise open source in the Western standpoint, it's still a very resource intensive activity at the end of the day. And so what's the sort of the impact that we see of the sort of legal burden, at least from the experiential standpoint? And so this is a interesting kind of compare and contrast of Gonkai versus Open, where on the left-hand side, I show a picture of a typical motherboard, which is sort of a fruit of the Shanzai ecosystem. On the right-hand side, I show an Arduino motherboard, which is sort of the fruit of the open hardware ecosystem. And so the open hardware ecosystem has yielded us a $29 circuit board, which consists of a 16 megahertz 8-bit CPU with 2.5K of RAM, a USB-C interface, and voltage regulator. And that would be sort of considered very standard in the open source world. On the left-hand side, from the Gonkai world, this ecosystem of sharing IP in China has yielded us a 260 megahertz 32-bit CPU with 8 megabytes of integrated RAM, a quad-band GSM modem, Bluetooth, OLED, MP3 player, lithium poly battery, and that whole thing is available for $12. And this sort of compare and contrast sort of gives a hint at the idea of maybe what might be possible if one reduces the legal burden of sharing IP and allows people to sort of just start remixing things and creating products based upon a much looser IP regimen. But then the question is like, how does Gonkai survive? According to basic Western IP theory, the bargain is broken. If people are able to sort of share IP so quickly, innovators and investors have no motive to take a risk. But the experience is showing that, sort of business is booming from these companies like, Xiaomi, which got a $4 billion valuation, or MediaTek, who has, made hundreds of millions of smartphone chips. And that was back in 2012. So the short answer is that, Gonkai itself is a Galapagos. It sort of grew up in an ecosystem, sort of clean sheet without any influence from the Western ecosystem, and it sort of figured out its own sets of cultural morals and rules and principles. And so sort of the image I like to sort of portray of this is that on the left-hand side here, you have a changing face. Sorry, so this slide here sort of shows a changing face of innovation. And so on the left here, you show what I like to see is sort of like a classic view of what Western IP is. This is a picture that was drawn, many, many years ago. And it shows sort of like the lone inventor, like literal graybeard, sort of in front of this glowing flask of phosphorus, and it's the point of revelation of the alchemist. In the background, yeah, there's a couple of younger people who might be doing something, but really, the whole idea is that innovation is about sort of celebrating this one lone hero. And we continue to sort of promulgate this idea in pop culture. So you have the idea of Tony Stark and Iron Man, who's like this sort of lone innovator who works alone, doesn't have any help, and he sort of just says, Jarvis, build me this wonderful idea, and he goes out drinking, he comes back, and this robot suit appears out of nowhere. But sort of the lone inventor is responsible for building all of these things. On the right-hand side is sort of more the face of Chinese innovation. This is actually a map of the internet where you can't really point to a particular person who has innovated, but still it's an emergent property of a very connected ecosystem. So the core point, I think, about sort of old versus new style of innovation is that the older style of innovation, patents and copyrights, is all about attribution. So we can go back to the archives and see in 1917, a guy named G. Sunback was granted patent 1,219,881 for the zipper. And today, on the right-hand side, we, in contrast to that, we share, for example, cat memes, a lot of pictures, which are this is just a clip from Google image search. And the interesting point about this is that every single one of those photographs actually have a copyright to them. The person who took those photographs technically have the exclusive right to the use of those pictures of those cats. But no one asks, for example, who took a picture of those cats. It's all about which one got the most clever caption and who's traded it the most. And anyone who's had to give talks and have to prove that they have the right to use all their sort of pictures will encounter the trouble of trying to attribute a meme. You want to go ahead and use a cat meme photo inside of a picture, and you want to say, hey, here's my disclosure and authorization to use these. They'll find that they can't find anyone, they can never find the original author who took a lot of these very popular meme photos. But we've accepted this in the Western ecosystem that virality is important and sort of look the other way when it comes to sort of copyrights on memes. So what you have here is you have sort of like a divergent evolution. You have an IP concept, they're the same class of sort of species, but they have different conditions. So like on the left, you have a mammal, which is a killer whale. On the right, you have a mammal, which is a bat. They're both, biologically related to each other, but they have very different, characteristics because of the environment in which they grew up in. And so IP in China, in particular, was sort of factory culture meeting the internet. And so factory culture in China itself sort of was the idea of promoting, sort of workers over all else. As you know, China has a sort of a communist past. Or a communist present, but, a much more hardcore communist past back in the days. This is one of their sort of propaganda photos where they show people, working together to build the great future of China, constructing a locomotive and so forth. And so they would actually sort of celebrate the workers and the people who would build things. The interesting thing is that a lot of people feel that they can just sort of start a factory now, right? So factories are cheap, and at the end of the day, everyone owns a factory in China. So this is a picture of a very small facility that I worked with at one point in time to build some plastic inserts for a book. This is both those men you see in the picture there are factory owners. The young guy on the left owns a printing factory. The older guy in the middle has a factory doing inserts for printed books. And it's kind of in a garage, literal sort of garage startup thing where he's sort of bought some equipment and he's able to stamp out the inserts for books. the result of this sort of factory culture is that you have what I call capability over inventory. So if you were to go, for example, to Best Buy and buy a USB cable, and you want a USB cable that's exactly 1.8 meters long because that's the distance from your keyboard to your computer, and you don't want to have an extra coil cable in it. You go up to the guy and say, "Hi, I'd like a 1.8 meter long USB cable." The blue shirt there would look at you and be like, "Well, we have 1.5 meter cables and 2 meter cables. Why don't you take the 2 meter cable and just coil the extra 0.2 meters, right? Leave off the side." You say, "No, no, no, I really want a 1.8 meter USB cable." He would look at you funny and be like, "What's wrong with you? Just buy our inventory. Like we've imported all this stuff from China for you. We only have 1.5 and 2." However, if you go to China and you meet someone who has a factory who builds cables, they have, raw wire and they have connector ends and they have an overmolding machine. That's what the machine there in the middle is. And you say, "Hello, I would like to have a 1.8 meter USB cable." The guy would be like, "Okay." He'll walk up to the machine, dial in 1.8 meters, and out ka-chunk would be your 1.8 meter cable. So in an ecosystem where people have factories, they're not trying to sell you a particular thing. They're not trying to sell you a certain length of cable. They can actually make you a cable to the size that you want in remarkably small quantities if you happen to know the person who owns the machine and can run the cables for you. And so what you have at the end of the day in this ecosystem is this massive set of factors and sub-suppliers which all come together through this sort of centralized market to go ahead and bring consumers products to consumers. And as evidence of this is that one of the complaints that happened when the Maker Faire went to Shenzhen is that it looked more like a trade show and less show and tell. And that's natural when you have basically everyone can own a factory. Even the makers own, sort of full-on factories with a little bit of money, is that you end up looking at what looks more like a CES rather than sort of a Maker Faire at the end of the day. So that's factory culture in China. Let's talk a little about sort of the internet in China. So this is the sort of a map of the internet from a bit of the way back. Content is pretty openly shared in China. So here's a screenshot of a website in China called DYTT8. It roughly translates to movie heaven. And you can see that, you can download Blu-ray disc copies, rips of, Finding Nemo, The Lion Walker, Chinese dramas, all this sort of stuff, The Bourne Ultimatum 5. They're all available. You just sort of click on it and download it for free. So, as people are well aware, there's a lot of sort of open content sharing in China, perhaps not always legally. The interesting part is that for technology, they have analogous websites. So there's a website here called 52rd.com where people can go ahead and ask questions and download, sort of mobile phone schematics and ask advice about things. So there's a thread here about everything you want to know about the new Apple chips, the new A10 chip, and so forth. And there's people asking questions about electromagnetic shielding and so on and so forth. And so if you were to go into one of these websites, you can go ahead and poke around and effectively download a phone, the plans for a phone. So these are some of the files that I got off of a site like this. You can get the full data sheet for the MediaTek sort of chip that's used on the inside, and of course it's fully covered with watermarks telling you that this is like confidential and not for release in someone else's IP, but people just download and share it. And I was able to, for example, download not just what are called the Gerber files, which is what's used to make the circuit board, but the actual design source, the OrCAD board files for the phone. So I could go ahead and take a phone, have the core IP, and then modify it, say change the shape of it to fit inside a different case very easily, and you're able to get the editable live schematics out of an ecosystem like this. So the net result of having sort of a factory culture meet this sort of rampant sharing style of internet on China is essentially you go from, instead of sharing cat memes, to sharing phone memes at the end of the day. So in the U.S., the sort of the virality ecosystem has gone from, the pinnacle of it is sort of cats with clever captions on it. And in China, the pinnacle of sort of virality and sharing there is, people rip, mix, burn hardware creating phones of all different types. So unpacking that ecosystem a little bit, instead of, if you're to look and sort of put labels on what all these different factors are in the ecosystem, is you have people who will specialize in very specific areas such as industrial design or plastics, tooling, components, firmware, circuit boards, and system integrators. And the role of sharing in a network like that is that you have so many different people who can give you, for example, components that in order to be discovered, it, in order to have sales, you need to be discovered. So one of the big sort of barriers to becoming successful and having your stuff out there isn't so much producing them or acquiring the goods, it's being discovered about it. So a lot of times, for example, component vendors like MediaTek will find ways to creatively leak their plans onto the internet so people can discover it. And then that would then get picked up by a PCBA manufacturer, who would then get picked up by a system integrator. All these people progressively leaking their levels of IP onto the internet so that they can be discovered, try and get into the final system that ultimately gets into consumers' hands. And this is one of those sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge things that both the manufacturers and the designers and the system integrators are all complicit on. But the ecosystem works out reasonably well, because at the end of the day, when you go ahead and you share the IP, the design IP for a product, you also have to buy the chip at the end of the day. It's not quite like sharing a movie, where the movie itself is the product, and you're actually just taking the product of a studio and watching it, not giving any money. Sharing the design IP for a chip in itself requires you to buy that chip. If you like what you see in the manual, you're going to eventually do a transaction that benefits the company that released the manual. And so at the end of the day, what you find is that embodiment really matters. Here's another sort of classic case of sort of patent versus product. On the left-hand side here is the patent for the two-wheel hoverboard, which you may have heard about. There's a big craze on that in the United States a couple years ago. And this is the patent that was filed by an inventor named Chen. And the patent's dated May 27th, 2014. It was filed on February 11th, 2013. And to this day, the person who filed the patent is still contemplating, how to monetize this patent. Do we, go through licensing, litigation, embodiment, and so on and so forth. At the same time that patent was filed, the Chinese ecosystem was cranking out, electric bikes, single-wheeled unicycles, electric bicycles and scooters and so on and so forth. So they're already doing things which are on its face relatively similar to the two-wheeled hoverboard, right? So they already embody these things. These are the prior art and the knowledge that exists in the ecosystem. The interesting part is that these aren't patents that they have. These are actual factories cranking out all these items. So when the two-wheel hoverboard was first kind of burst onto the scene, the story I've heard is that Justin Bieber was seen rolling onto a stage with it, and demand sort of exploded for these things. There was already a huge infrastructure of people who were able to build all the components that went into the two-wheel hoverboard. People who could build the high torque, low RPM motors. People who could build the cases necessary. People who build the powertrains and the battery systems that go into these. And so to go ahead and actually go from what they were building today to the two-wheel hoverboard was a very small leap for them. And so they were able to quickly embody the idea just from seeing it on a picture on a screen. They didn't even have to read the patent at the end of the day. And so, there's a question here is when you have an ecosystem like this, which one is more valuable? Is it products or is it patents? So generally speaking, in this ecosystem, people will instead of spending money on the legalese to go ahead and protect their intellectual property, they'll rather spend money to go ahead and build the product, get it out there, and sort of trade them very rapidly. And what you end up with at the end of the day is sort of a reinforcement cycle. You have people who are rapidly embodying products, who are getting money for investing in factories, creating capability, and then going ahead and releasing new product into the ecosystem very quickly. And so this has sort of led to an emergent sort of innovation. So you go from sort of funky little phones like the one on the left here, which is a phone made for kids, to sort of like the Xiaomi's of the world, who are able to build phones that hold their own against Samsungs and Sonys and HTCs. to now what we have is like literal people who are promoting open platforms in the ecosystem. So you can see this slide here of Alipay wallet. They use the words Kaifang Pingtai, which means literally an open platform for financial transactions. And Alipay in 2014 handled $778 billion of transactions, whereas Apple Pay in 2015 has only managed to cover $11 billion in transactions. So you have this sort of like emergent innovation, rapid adoption that's happening in the ecosystem because of the sort of the low barrier to sort of trading and sharing IP at the end of the day. And so, again, what you have is sort of different conditions yielding to different species, but both are mammals. You have IP from the West and also IP in the East. Both have their sort of, quid pro quo in the method of sharing about them. But, IP in the West sort of is designed to encourage, high risk, basic research. So if you're going to do things like nuclear physics or sort of drug discovery, that sort of thing, it's a very good impedance match for that. You can have predictable, defensible earning models, and you also have a very methodical innovation. So you have named inventors, people whose names are attached. They must be attached to patents. Like you can't file a patent on behalf of an open ecosystem. Like if you're an open source, you just want to say, I want to protect this idea from trolls taking it. You can't be like, I file this on behalf of a community. You have to put your name on that patent and then license it to that community. In comparison, the Chinese style of innovation that's arisen there is an agile, robust network that handles systemic complexity very well. So if you want to build very complex products that have a lot of different parts, you have a very deep ecosystem you can pull from of sub-vendors to do this without having to invest and build all of that from scratch. The problem is that you have a pretty constant churn that's fairly competitive. You have to sort of, continue to invest into your ecosystem and into your factory to go ahead and stay competitive. And at the end of the day, what you have is that innovation is more of an emergent property of that network. You don't have named inventors, but rather you have a whole network itself creating an innovation ecosystem. So the opportunity at the end of the day that I feel is sort of, how do you sort of take the best of both worlds? And this is what I've been doing for the last few years in China is, how do I harness that loose ecosystem of innovators and sort of try to put a capstone on top of that and figure out how to, bring, sort of products to consumers at extremely, sort of at disruptive price points and sort of disruptive amounts of sort of upfront costs to getting those products into the ecosystem. And so that's my talk. I guess I'll open the floor to questions.
Cool. Yay. Microphone.
Nobody has any questions?
So if you said you wanted to do a capstone on top of it, but the standard Western responses, but you'll get 2% of the market and Amazon will be flooded with clones in 48 hours. So
That's correct.
So what do? Slap a Justin Bieber sticker on it?
No. So part of the idea behind this is that the idea is not to capstone it as being a brand, in the sense that I'm just sort of taking another factory's product and selling it on the market. That's the way you end up with 98% of the stuff on Amazon being clones. You actually need to be a little closer to the ecosystem. You don't just capstone it by literally putting a layer of paint on it. You capstone it by being sort of an apex factory in the ecosystem. And so, for example, one of the things I try to focus on is process innovation in an actual facility in China. I go into a factory in China, I take a process they have, and I modify in a way that's not obvious to produce something that people haven't seen before. A different finish, a different flexibility, a different material system altogether. And so if another factory were to see it, they would actually have to think pretty hard. How do I do this? They don't. So the problem with the hoverboard was that all the separate parts were available. Like there was almost zero modification required from the standard process to build the hoverboard. It was just a rejiggering of Lego parts, so to speak. And so the idea is you want to go ahead and you want to leverage the pieces you have in Shenzhen, but put them together in a way that is not obvious. That requires someone to do a bit of hard R&D to try and create the product that you're creating.
So that changes the threshold from 48 hours to 8 months?
Yeah, I would say one of the products I recently introduced, I'm doing flexible circuits that have a stickerable backing on them. And that took us about I'd say 6 to 8 months to sort of develop that process in China with a factory. And we've had numerous actually attempts of people from actually the United States and other people in places in China trying to copy us, but no one's been able to figure out the process that we have. And it's essentially a trade secret process that we do with one vendor in China.
Cool. Does this work for sort of complex? Okay, I'm going to figure out the question while Alan asks the real question.
So
Sure.
is there a qualitative difference in the kind of innovation you get from these two styles? It seems like there would be.
Yeah, there is a difference in the types of innovation that you get out of it. Like you do get, from the Western ecosystem. Like I said here, you get a little more high risk basic research. So you get some very clever things out of the Western ecosystem, but a lot of times you also get in terms of what you need to hammer the nails, you need a hammer. You don't necessarily need a robotic system that can go ahead and place nails in with a controlled force profile all the time. And so you tend to get more hammers out of the Chinese ecosystem, and you tend to get more sophisticated, very precise things out of the Western ecosystem. But one of the other qualitative things that you see that's different, though, is that, for example, out of the Chinese ecosystem, you can get mobile phones, whereas the Western ecosystem has failed by and large at the startup level to create phones. Like Apple has created phones because they have a huge amount of money to invest to create a vertical ecosystem of suppliers to sort of go feed into their phones. But I've seen people, I had a picture, I think, up here on the upper left-hand corner here. This is it looks a little campy, but it's a phone made for kids to call home. But the parents don't want kids to be distracted in class texting. So you see it only has like 5 buttons on it where you pre-assign the numbers using like a little USB UI, and then the kids can take it and call home. There's actually been, I did a little research on this, and there was a couple startups in the United States that raised $5 to $10 million to try and build something exactly like this. And they all failed because, IP constraints, they couldn't get the license for the spectrum, had to do with the carriers, all sorts of stuff. And there's like a dozen of these phones in the market in China, and the rumor has it they cost them about $25,000 to $50,000 to crank out this particular model. And so from the Chinese side, they deal with systemic complexity. So the reason why they're able to crank this out for so little is that there's these other vendors who are building the basebands, other vendors are building the firmware, other vendors are building the plastics, and so a system integrator only has to spend a small amount of money to create what would be a substantially complex product in the United States.
I was thinking more in terms of things that need a whole ecosystem. So, for example, the iPod needed iTunes. Nespresso needs the whole supply chain of the pods and the coffee and the quality management. That seems to be quite different in qualitatively from the kind of innovation you've been talking about in Shenzhen.
That's an interesting question. You are starting to see more of the sort of larger, so you have a consumable plus a goods thing starting to occur. So the bigger brands like Xiaomi and Alibaba are starting to create these types of systems. So Alipay itself, has created this ecosystem that you have to have the phones, you have to have the payment infrastructure, you have to have the QR code readers, and so on and so forth. And they're doing $770 billion of business. They have an Uber equivalent there. They have an Amazon equivalent there. I don't think there's, for example, as much of a market for Nespresso, because the Chinese people just wouldn't pay $2 for a cup of coffee when they can pay much, much less for a coffee through other mechanisms. But Nespresso has done a really good job of marketing their product and making people feel that it's worth those little capsules at the end of the day. But I think you are starting to see a bit of this as the ecosystem matures and grows up, I think.
But are those models fitting your model of the Shenzhen very loose man? Everybody's a manufacturer, buy the parts from the guy down the street. It sounds like Alipay is a much more centralized, big infrastructure kind of play than the kind of things you've been describing. And that's what I meant by the qualitative difference. That doesn't seem to fit the innovation pattern that you were describing for that little phone on the left.
I am seeing some things like that. I mean, it's not, you won't get exactly analogous to what you see in the West, obviously, but you could think of, in a way, sort of the ecosystem as the Nespresso for hardware, right? I mean, you have like these facilities that can crank out like things that are built in these facilities, in these factories. But your point is taken. I mean, you want to be able to create protected ecosystems to do these big ecosystem plays. But I think with the open platforms, because the adoption can be so wide, you have sort of like this sort of chicken and egg problem, right? For like Nespressos, you have to get enough coffee makers out there to make it worthwhile filling a supply chain full of coffee, packets, right? And so one way is we're going to protect the Nespresso capsule format, and we're going to have the monopoly in this, and we're going to be able to monetize getting this all out there. Another one is like, we're just going to I'm going to open up a factory that makes capsules, and we're going to make them super cheap, and everyone's going to just use this capsule standard, and people just start building whatever machines they want around this capsule standard. And then at the end of the day, may the best person win, and my factory is still making a lot of money because I'm just cranking out capsules at the end of the day. I'm not as valuable as Nespresso as a brand, but as an individual who's interested in making a factory that does capsules, I'm making a lot of money at the end of the day. And so you don't quite get like that brand power, but I think you still do get some of these emergent phenomenons of people, standardizing and creating really big open platforms that that a lot of people adopt and eventually get to a very high scale.
Cool. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. By the way,
All right, thanks.
thank you.